Welcome to Intangibles, a podcast about traits, behaviors, and qualities that entrepreneurs can cultivate to help be successful. I'm your host, Steve BERG. I'm a partner at a New York City-based venture capital fund called Lytical Ventures. Lytical Ventures focuses on early-stage investments of companies that drive corporate intelligence. Corporate intelligence includes, for example, cybersecurity, data and analytics, and artificial intelligence. You can find us at www.lyticalventures.com. Lytical is spelled Lytical, Ventures, all one word, .com. This season is brought to you by Denton's Venture Technology Group at dentonsventurebeyond.com. Operating as a boutique within the world's largest law firm, the Venture Technology Group runs with hard-charging tech entrepreneurs to drive growth through strategic business, finance, and legal advice from Silicon Valley and New York to London, Berlin, Hong Kong, and beyond. Learn more at dentonsventurebeyond.com. We have a new production partner this season, VC Careers. If you're looking for a job in venture capital, join over 8,000 VCs and VC job hunters on John Gannon's VC Jobs email list. Visit johngannonblog.com/intangibles to learn more and to subscribe. Also, please find Intangibles on its new home on the web, www.intangiblespodcast.com. Felix Frankfurter was an Associate Justice of the Supreme Court of the United States and also had a fantastically novel name. His view was that the indispensable judicial requisite was and is intellectual humility. Intellectual humility is a virtue, a character trait that allows the intellectually humble person to think and reason well. It is plausibly related to open-mindedness, a sense of one's own fallibility, and a healthy recognition of one's intellectual debts to others. Being intellectually humble is way easier said than done, especially if you have spent a considerable amount of time studying any particular topic. Not coincidentally, many of the founders I back have done just that as a prerequisite for innovation. Duncan Pritchard is a professor of philosophy. He is currently at University of California, Irvine as Chancellor's professor of philosophy, but has held chairs in philosophy at the universities of Edinburgh and Stirling, Scotland. He has also held visiting positions at the University of Connecticut, Storrs, the University of Helsinki, and Aarhus University, Denmark. He has studied the problem of skepticism, the rationality of religious belief, but his main area of focus is epistemology, which is the theory of knowledge, especially with regard to its methods, validity, and scope. This, of course, includes intellectual humility. Hi, Dr. Pritchard. Thanks for taking the time today.
No problem. Great to be here. Thanks for inviting me to be on.
Let's go back to the definition of intellectual humility. Can you break down intellectual humility for us? I mean, is it simply put being open-minded? I have a sense that it's significantly more than that.
Well, one of the problems with intellectual humility at the moment is that there are so many different accounts of it available. And on some accounts, it probably is just the same thing as being open-minded. My own view about intellectual humility is that it isn't that. It may entail that. So it may be that if you have intellectual humility, then you're open-minded. But I'm not sure necessarily if you're open-minded, you have intellectual humility. I mean, it seems to me being open-minded just means you're willing to listen to other people's opinions. But that might just be a kind of just the way you are, that you listen to other people's opinions. Intellectual humility is more that it's rooted in certain kinds of distinctive motivations. And on my view, at least, intellectual humility is rooted in a certain kind of respect for others and for ideas and for reasons, such that even if you know full well that you've thought about this longer and harder than other people, still when other people come along with different points of view, you're willing to listen to what they say, to engage with them, to come up with, to give your own reasons to why you think what you do, and to reflect on their reasons and so on, and to be willing to engage in that kind of rational interaction. And I think that's what's important here, is that's the kind of thing that you can do, even if you may recognize that you have actually thought this all through, and you have covered all options and so on. Being intellectually humble isn't, and I think this is quite crucial, it isn't a kind of downgrading of oneself, which is what it is on some views. on my view, it isn't that bad. It's not about how you think about yourself so much. It's how you treat others. It's your sort of outer-directed traits. And it's crucial, as I say, that these outer-directed traits, that they're rooted in distinctive motivations, that you're doing this not to kind of humor people or anything like that, but you're doing it because you care about reasons and you respect other people, you respect the reasons they have. And because of that, you're willing to engage in this enterprise, this collective enterprise of trying to work out what the best things to believe are.
So it sounds much more akin to open-mindedness, right? Because you can still be expert on a topic, but wait, I don't know everything. There's more to potentially learn, or there's another perspective to bring to it. So instead of just saying, well, I know everything, even if you might know everything, you want to hear somebody else expound on an idea in the event that there is something.
Yeah, I think so. And this is what's kind of crucial. On some views of intellectual humility, it would be automatically arrogant, lacking in intellectual humility if you thought of yourself as an expert, right? There would just like the very idea that someone could be an expert would be problematic. On my view, there's nothing problematic about that because it's not about how you rate yourself. It's more about how you treat other people and how your respect for reasons and for other people as rational subjects. So it's perfectly consistent with that you might think that you might have very good reason for thinking you are the best, you are the expert on this, right? You are the top authority. But what makes you intellectually humble is the fact that even though you might recognize that, you're still willing to engage with others. You're still willing to find out, well, is there more to learn? And equally, even if you think that other people's reasons are completely wrong, just to try and explain why your reasons are what they are, that kind of engagement, I think that's what marks people out as intellectually humble.
Right. So
just simply cut the conversation dead and say, look, I'm an expert. Deal with it, sort of thing.
Right. So if I had a spectrum and my spectrum went from arrogance and vanity on one side to self-depreciation and diffidence on the other side, I hope that you're saying that intellectual humility is the mean.
Yeah, I would say that. Here's what's tricky about that, though, that if you put it that way, then it still makes intellectual humility about you and your attitude to yourself rather than your attitude to other people. So I think that is right, in the sense that, if you are intellectually humble, then you're the kind of person that's somewhere in between being, vain and arrogant. On the one hand, arrogant, on the other hand, being incredibly self-depreciating. But I also think that, one could have that attitude of being on that mean without really manifesting these outer-directed traits, without really caring about other people and their reasons. You might just keep it to yourself. That's not what the intellectually humble person does. I think if they're outer-directed, right? It's directed at other people. Right?
Yeah.
It's about reasons and other people's reasons and a concern for people as rational subjects and therefore a concern for the reasons that they have.
Yeah.
And I think that's kind of crucial because otherwise you could be intellectually humble in a kind of in a quiet, passive sort of way. And I don't think it's like that. I think it's got to be more engaged than that.
So it's not the what, right? It's the motivation for the what that you're referring to. Okay.
And this is true, by the way, of all the intellectual, if all the virtues, full stop, but all the intellectual virtues, it's really important where they come from. Someone could manifest these traits, but they could do so in strategic ways. They could do it just because they just think, oh, they'll look better, or people will vote for me, or something like that. There could be all kinds of strategic reasons they might have. But that's not what intellectual humility is. It's got to arise out of a genuine concern for reasons and for other people.
I'm going to detour just a little bit. In the intro, I mentioned that your main area of focus is epistemology. Could you at least define epistemic for us?
Sure.
That's not an everyday word for a lot of people, I don't think.
Yeah, that's true. It's not an everyday word. What it relates to, I think, is a distinction we do have in everyday life. But you're right, we don't use that word for it. It's this idea of what we're interested in as epistemologists is the truth and how we get to it. So it's interesting in a whole range of notions like rationality, knowledge, reasons, evidence, and so on. All these things that are connected to the truth in important ways. And I think we recognize this in everyday life, that some things we believe because we wish they were true. Maybe I've got no reason to think that that I will live to 100, but I want it to be true. But then there are things that we believe, and we believe for reasons, and that's when we believe in the epistemic sense. We're sort of trying to get to the truth, and that's what epistemologists are interested in. How do we what is the truth, and how do we get to it?
So I think that's why intellectual humility is a subset of that, right? Because in truth, intellectual humility really is the search for the absolute value of a thing, the truth, in essence, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
So all the virtues, they're geared towards the good in the most general sense, and the intellectual virtues are geared towards the intellectual goods. And the intellectual goods, primarily that's truth. We want to get to the what's reality, what's real, what's the truth. And so all of those kinds of traits are specifically geared towards those intellectual goods, as opposed to, let's say, moral virtues, which are geared more towards moral goods.
Yeah. I would think that, everyone should always be trying to tell themselves the truth. Do we need to be intelligent to be intellectually humble?
Well, the thing about intelligence is that it comes in lots of different forms. Even people who study this will say, in the contemporary, parlance, the idea is you can measure intelligence with IQ, but no one who actually works on intelligence really thinks that. You're just measuring a certain kind of intelligence. There's all different kinds of intelligence. And if you look back to the ancient Greeks, someone like Aristotle, who really came up with all the theory of virtues, I think the way he would put it is that you certainly need quite a lot of knowledge, and you certainly need quite a lot of expertise in order to be virtuous. But the kinds of things he's talking about as knowledge and expertise here are really very practically orientated. It's not necessarily a very cerebral thing. It's not like being able to jump through intellectual hoops in the way an IQ test might be. So yes, you need some basic level of intelligence, some competence, some basic level of knowledge, I think, because these are skills. And like with all skills, you need to have the right kind of knowledge in order to be able to use them effectively. But I don't think this is really a barrier. For many people, it's a pretty straightforward thing to have. These are very much practically orientated knowledge that one needs to have in the background in order to manifest these skills. I mean, really, what you need to have is the right kind of motivations. That matters more than what you know. You could know lots of things, lack the motivations, and you'll lack the virtues. And on the Aristotelian view, if you lack the virtues, then a lot of the goods that flow to your life from being virtuous just don't flow anymore.
So I mean, as I relate it to what we just said about intellectual humility being the search for truth, you just need to be smart enough to believe that you're capable of increasing your knowledge, right? That you're capable of getting closer to the truth. I mean, that's the minimum smart you need to be able to possess intellectual humility.
Yes, I think that's probably right. Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, the only reason I hesitate is that there is a famous category of ancient Greek thinkers who thought that the virtuous good life involved a certain kind of skepticism, where you didn't actually believe anything. You believed as little as you possibly could. But put those guys to one, they're called Pyrrhonians. Put the Pyrrhonians to one side, and I think that's absolutely right.
The skepticism, we're not talking about Stoicism, though. That's different.
No, actually, the Stoics are a million miles away from the Pyrrhonians.
Okay,
the Pyrrhonians if you like, Pyrrhonian skepticism is kind of like an inversion of Stoicism. The Stoics thought that you should suppress the passions and live by reason, and the Pyrrhonians thought you should suppress reason and live by the passions. But they both think that the good life comes, that they're both giving an account of what the good life is, and they're both giving an alternative account of virtues. But I'm more inclined towards the Aristotelian view, and I think what you just said is absolutely right with the Aristotelian view.
It's comforting to know, because I'm much more along the Stoic notion of what it ought to be. So one of the things that strikes me is that everybody brings their own perspective, right? You've had a bunch of experiences. I've had a bunch of experiences. So we perceive things differently based on that collection of experiences. I don't think that we're heading toward the direction that intellectual humility relates solely to knowledge. I think we're heading in the direction that perspective does come into play. Is that correct?
Well, it's not just about knowledge. It's about certain kinds of distinctive ways of behaving. And like how you manifest that will be dependent on your perspective to the following degree, that what you think is your epistemic situation, what you think you know, is going to have a bearing on how you relate to disagreement, right? When people come along who have different points of view, right? But I think it's important not to overstate that. Yes, we have lots of different experiences and we come to these disagreements from a different background. But if you think about it, there's a lot of things that we have in common. I mean, the thirst for truth, I think, is a common thing across human beings. Aristotle famously said that we're rational creatures, and he thought he said, by our nature we desire to know. That's it. That's part of what it is to be a human being. We want to know. We want the truth. And we have this thirst for it. And I think this is something that has in common. And it means that although there's all kinds of social forces which try and force us away from this, they try and get us to not care about the truth. Often, in our interactions with others, if they're honest, sincere interactions, you can see how people are trying to get to the truth through these engagements. So the difference is that what I'm getting at is, it's kind of dangerous in a way to overstate them because the commonalities are so strong in terms of what drives us.
Yeah. Well, the other thing is, I mean, it just doesn't take too much to see the benefits of drive toward the truth, of intellectual humility. I think we should talk about it, honestly. All right. So that a good portion of people that listen to the podcast, they're entrepreneurs, right? They're founders. They're people who have innovated or created something and are putting it out into the world. So let's try and consider the benefits of intellectual humility from the perspective of this person interjecting a new idea and weighing as soberly as possible what the input back is from that, right? I know, I'm not even sure there's a question in there, honestly, but a little rumination from you on the notion of the benefits of intellectual humility as it relates to putting something new forward, I think would be great.
So I think my account of intellectual humility, it fits very well with the scenario like an entrepreneur. Because what's crucial to an entrepreneur, an inventor, or what have you, is that they absolutely have to have self-confidence in what they're doing. They're taking huge risks. If they don't have confidence in what they're doing, I mean, one would hope it's a grounded confidence, right? But if they don't have confidence that they really know what they're doing here, then this isn't going to work. I mean, we know just from the outset that confidence is what's going to make this, make the project even have a chance of success. So what's crucial about my view is that having self-confidence in your opinions is not a barrier to being intellectually humble. Yeah. So on standard views, it is, because you've got to kind of denigrate yourself. You've got to lower your estimation of yourself. But I think that's the wrong way to think about it. What makes you intellectually humble isn't your confidence in yourself. It's how you treat other people, how you treat ideas. When contrary ideas come along, are you receptive to them? Will you listen? Are you willing to explain to others why you're so confident in what you believe, or do you just simply assert that you're an expert? It's these kind of outer traits. For me, intellectual humility is outer directed. It's not inner directed. It's not about how you think about yourself primarily. It's about how you treat other people and how you treat ideas. Yeah. And so the two things are completely compatible. You can have the self-confidence of an entrepreneur, but you can also manifest the traits of the intellectually humble agent. And insofar as you do that, I think you're more likely to succeed as an entrepreneur, because the thing about intellectual humility, it helps you get to the truth. Being open to ideas, listening to other ideas, being willing to explain your own ideas. These are all important traits if you care about the truth, and over time they will get you to the truth. So if, maybe even though you are the expert on this, maybe you're the expert about this invention, maybe there are things you haven't considered, and maybe listening to other people, maybe describing your reasons over and again to other people, in an open way will get you to see things differently. I mean, I find this is something people who teach say all the while. You may teach this, it may seem boring to teach the same things over and over again, but what you discover very quickly is that you're not teaching the same thing over and over again. It's different every time. And every time you engage with people, new things arise. And if things you've thought about a million times over, suddenly you see something different about it because of how it came out that day and how someone responded to it. And I think this highlights the importance of just being open to that. Yeah, and how it helps us get to the truth.
That's a mindful approach. I'll tell you that, when I invest in a founder, I'm looking for that intellectual humility, right? Because the things that I've noticed that go along with it, if I find someone that I define as intellectually humble, that person, they tend to be a better learner broadly, which is hugely important as you're kind of going along and evolving an idea. I think that allows disagreement, but in a productive way. Yeah. Right. There's a thing that, there's civil discourse associated with exchanging, an intellectually humble person, like you said, doesn't just build a wall that says, forget it. You're not going to let anything in. I know. I also find that it, in general, me among others, that I deal with, we have a tendency to kind of overestimate our strengths. I feel like intellectual humility provides a reasonable counter to that, right? Yeah. If at very least a balance to that. What I wonder is, so there's, you highlighted a bunch of benefits. There's certainly things that I see as well. It seems to me, with that as the backdrop, why wouldn't everybody want to naturally be intellectually humble? What are the hurdles that are preventing global intellectual humility?
So one hurdle is just simply human nature. Lots of people have talked about this. Aristotle talked about it. Hume talked about it. We have this, and psychologists have explored this. We have this natural capacity to overestimate our abilities. There may be good evolutionary reasons for it. I mean, it turns out that people who tend to have accurate conceptions of themselves and their abilities are more prone to depression, more lacking in self-confidence. It seems like, in a way, kind of being psychologically healthy often involves a certain degree of overestimation. And so you can imagine there might be all kinds of evolutionary advantages to that. So we're kind of fighting against human nature. But I think, our higher intellectual selves, I think, can harness this, even if it is this inner drive to be like that. I mean, the other thing to remember is that we care about the truth, and I think it's true that most people do. Whether they would say that or not, I think on some level they do care about the truth. When they're going into a doctor's surgery, they do care whether the doctor knows what he's doing, and so forth. When they're making their investments, they care that the information on their screen is accurate and so on. So at some level, people care about the truth. But of course, we also care about lots of other things as well. We care about, we're vain, we care about how we're perceived, we want to do the right thing by people, we care about all kinds of practical things, achieving certain things and so forth. And these are the values, they can get in the way. And that's another reason why, as Aristotle said, you can't just suddenly become virtuous. It has to be trained up through a process you call habituation. And it can be lost as well. It's not like once you have it thereafter. It has to be cultivated, otherwise it just starts to fade, So it's not like riding a bicycle where once you've learnt it forever. So, you've got to keep cultivating it.
So I can tell that there's going to be questions about that. So I'm going to hold those in abeyance for just a second. So, all right, we've got ego, we've got pride, we've got the disdain for possibly being wrong or thought of as being wrong. Okay, that's human frailty. That's fine. Is self-awareness with regard to those frailties, is that enough to clear the hurdle toward intellectual humility? Or do we need to have more than just the awareness that these are potentially limiting factors?
Yeah, self-awareness is necessary, but it's far from being sufficient. And in fact, this is something people discover time and time again with cognitive biases in general. Being aware that you have a certain bias is not enough to remove it. You've got to. That's why scientists have double-blind trials. Because even if they were the best one in the world, they know that various biases are going to creep in there, and so they have to structure their experimentation methods in such a way as to get rid of them. And in fact, that's what we have to do. And we do this in life anyway. When we have appointing panels and we're careful about how we handle referee reports, how we handle interviews and so on. We're conscious of the fact that these things can creep in. It's not so much we don't trust people. We know that even people with good wills can creep in. And this goes back to this idea of virtues not being easy. It has to be cultivated.
Mm-hmm.
And the way it works for Aristotle, and I think this is probably the only way it's going to work, you have these paradigms around you, and that's what you have to look for. You have to try and emulate them. When I think about intellectual humility, there's certain people I have in mind, that I've encountered who I think are particularly wise and having these virtuous traits. And I just think, well, what would they do? And in fact, one person in particular, the reason I ended up with my account actually was in part because of thinking about this person, how they're the expert in my field. And they know they're the expert, and it would be bizarre if they didn't know that they're the expert in my field, but they don't act like the expert in my, they listen, they engage with others. And at times it must even be sort of infuriating, or for most people it would be anyway, to try and explain things which they must have gone over 1,000 times. But they always do it with this patience and generosity and so on. And I think, well, what they're manifesting there is the virtues. But they're not thereby, there's no sense of denigrating themselves. They must know on some level they're the expert, right? They have all these plaudits and so forth. So I think, this is what we need to do. We need to identify these virtuous people around us, and then we need to emulate them. Right. And that's how you train up your virtue. So awareness is the first step. The second step is find the virtuous person and emulate them.
Okay. I think there's a piece in there. I want to just double check to make sure. So I think you kind of said it without saying it, that, okay, beyond understanding your own limitations, you actually have to take responsibility for your limitations, right? You have to say, yes, it's more than just, okay, I've probably got these. You probably have to go, okay, I've got these, and as a result, I do the following 3 things. So I've got to limit myself in doing those 3 things to lower the barrier to be able to, take in other people's perspectives, to be patient okay.
Yeah, that's right. Really knowing it won't make you act differently.
Right.
But know it and then set upon certain courses of action to make you act differently. And I think one of those is to look at virtuous people and see how they behave. In your admiration for them, try and cultivate those same traits in yourself. So
is that actually habituation? Because you said that word before, and so that's what it is, right? That's
yeah. So the idea is to begin with, you're doing it in a conscious way, but that over time it'll become unconscious.
Right.
And that's the thing about genuine virtue isn't intellectual, or it doesn't look that way to others. It looks natural. But that's not because it is natural. It's because it's become natural over time. It's become, as Aristotle said, second nature. That's where we get the idea of second nature from. Your first nature is kind of like your natural nature. Your second nature is your learned nature, and you can train that up. But second nature can look like first nature. Someone's trained themselves up very well, and that's what habituation gives you.
Right. Yeah. So the goodness associated with what you just said is. And by the way, I find this, the podcast is called Intangibles, right? And there are supposedly all these things that, you're born with, or they're in your DNA or whatever. What you find out all the time is that most of these things you possess some level of, but nearly all of them, I can't really even think of any of them, frankly, that you cannot improve your level of curiosity, creativity, intellectual humility. And I think that's what you just said right there, is that, there's steps that practitioners take to become intellectually more humble. So besides habituation, is there anything else that you would say that, again, for the founders out there that are trying to improve their ability to seek the truth, besides habituation, that they should study up?
I mean, there's one thing which I think it can be adapted here, but it comes from thinking about educating kids, actually, is that, and this fits entirely with the notion of virtues, is that one thing that people have discovered is, don't tell kids that they're idiots, but don't tell them they're geniuses either. Either strategy is a disaster. You tell a kid they're an idiot, then they just won't try. But if you tell them they're a genius, you tell them they're brilliant, which is now, this is the modern thing. When I was growing up, it was normal. Teachers told everyone they're idiots. That was just the way they operated. Now everyone's wonderful. Everyone's great, But this has the opposite problem, is that when they encounter a difficulty, something they can't work out, they blame the problem. They don't blame themselves. So what you've got to do is give people the right kinds of traits. So don't focus on what they know or they don't know. Don't focus on that current level of expertise and knowledge. Focus more on their traits, right? They've got to have the right kind of traits. And what you're focusing on there is their intellectual virtues. Give people intellectual virtues, train them up in those traits, and then they can adapt to all kinds of different situations. So it's not really about, going back to what you said before about having to be clever to be virtuous. Well, that kind of in a way gets it the wrong way around. I think being virtuous, intellectually virtuous, is the way to be intelligent, right? It's because it's not to be intelligent in any particular way. It's to be intelligent in a way that's entirely adaptable to whatever situation arises. So I think that's what you need to cultivate. And I think although that works with kids, I think it works just as much with, suppose you've got a team, you're trying to motivate that team. Don't think, so-and-so is the expert and so-and-so is, so-and-so is the useless component on this. Don't think of people as static like that. Think of them in terms of their traits. Develop and cultivate those traits, and don't think about just simply their current level of expertise and whatever that might be, because that's the wrong way. That's the wrong way around, as it were. Focus on developing their traits, and then you'll develop the team and what it can do.
Yeah, I think that curiosity is the underpinning of that, and that is the propulsive engine that you're talking about, I think. Okay, so I'm half a click back. We talked a little bit about self-confidence not necessarily being a bad thing, self-belief, self-reliance, also having impacts, but not necessarily the worst thing. All right. As a person who errs on the side of self-confidence, myself, that meaning that given the choice of my kind of modestly informed belief versus someone else, I'll usually take my own, right? I'll usually have confidence in the fact that I've done the work. The thing that's not right about what I just said is the belief part. I'd like to talk about belief as a component of intellectual humility. I think because in general, back to founders work with this incomplete set of information, right? So as a rule, they base a lot of their decision, a lot of their knowledge seeking on belief. There's a couple of questions that are resulting from that. The first is, what does it mean to say that you actually know something? How do you know that you know it, as opposed to you just believe it and it may or may not be true?
Okay, good. So knowledge, people disagree. I mean, I have my own views about what knowledge is, but most people would agree that at the very least it involves this. Knowledge is true belief that is grounded in good reasons. Now, most people think there's different views about how to understand that and what to add to it, but most people would agree at least on that part. So what you're saying there, what's the difference between knowledge and mere true belief? It's this extra bit grounded in good reasons. If I'm just believing something on a hunch or guesswork or what have you, I don't have any no good reasons for thinking that it's true anyway. Or if I ground it on just the fact that I wish that it were true, wishful thinking. Well, yeah, I mean, one can form beliefs in that way, but I don't have a reason to think it's true. But if I've done my homework and I've studied it and so forth, I can work out whether I do have good reasons. Now you're right. A lot of the kind of activities that you're talking about, where people are, they're making predictions about the future, for example. They're making predictions about markets, about how technology is going to develop and so forth. A lot of this isn't going to be if it is knowledge at all, it's not going to be very secure knowledge, because of course, there's lots of things. There's lots of uncertainty there too. But I still think there is something that can be known. So, like someone who's done all their homework. Well, all their homework is, as it were, that's knowledge, which they can then bank. And then on the basis of that knowledge, they can then make confident predictions. Now, of course, the predictions themselves might not count as knowledge. They might count as just predictions. But they're not just guesswork either. They are still grounded in reasons. They might not meet the threshold for knowledge, but they're grounded in reasons. Indeed, they're grounded in knowledge. And that would be the difference between someone who does their homework as opposed to someone, a maverick, let's say, who just got these hunches that they work on. Well, if they go on hunches, then, all they have is the guesswork. They don't have knowledge. It's not grounded in anything. And that's the difference, I think. We want the former, not the latter.
So that's where it gets wobbly, right? There's this U2 song, a recent U2 lyric. And the lyric is, the worst things in the world are justified by belief. And the implication is because it's someone's belief, there's no defense for it. You cannot defend against that. I believe it. Well, but it's not true, but I believe it. And so how do you maintain intellectual humility without clear evidence of a thing, right? Without what you were just discussing before, you've done your homework, there's a body of knowledge around that informs a belief. What happens when there's not a body of knowledge around?
So you mean where all you have to go on is your instinct or something like that?
Yeah.
Even then, there is something, right? Look, for example, sometimes I joke when we're doing philosophy. I'll say I've got a feeling there's a good idea here. And I might say, my philosophical spidey senses are tingling, right? And the reason I say that is the thought is it's more than just guesswork, right? I've done this enough now that I've got a kind of sense for things. Maybe I can't quite articulate it yet, but there's something in this idea. Let's run with it. And there's not something in that idea. Let's not run with it. But this isn't just guesswork or hunches, it seems to me. I've got a track record that I'm going on. And I think this is what you need here. If you have got a track record of working in a certain field, I think this is true in engineering. I mean, I'm very interested in Formula One engineering. It's a science, but the great engineers, often they scribble things in the back of an envelope and they design cars that way. They just got a hunch about things. But it's not a stab in the dark, right? They know, they've got so much expertise grounding this. They know that there's, even if they can't articulate why this is a good idea just now, they've got enough of a reason looking at their track record for thinking, I should trust this hunch. And that's why they get paid lots of money as well. It's not that people think that these guys are just following their hunches. They know that there's something grounding them. And I think this is what you've got to ask yourself if you're an entrepreneur following your hunches. Do I have a track record here? If I don't, then really, what is there to go on?
Yeah. I think that what you just gave is a really great answer. And it does kind of put a platform under what would normally be kind of shaky ground. I'm still going to press on it kind of one more time or one more piece of that. I was alluding kind of in the run up to the other thing that seems to go along with this beliefism almost. And that's entrenchment, right? You're entrenched in an idea and it makes seeking the truth harder, right? And it makes you ever more confident, which in this case is not a virtue. Are there ways to avoid entrenchment as a subset of belief so that you can be open-minded when it comes to new information?
Yeah, I mean, the only way actually is through intellectual virtue. So here's the thing, right? You're right about entrenchment. This is our natural state. It's called confirmation bias, right? I mean, this is one aspect of it anyway. I mean, this is why scientists are very careful about the way they design experiments, because they know that if you don't design them very carefully, then you will, even if you're really conscious of what confirmation bias is, you'll find yourself focusing on the evidence that confirms what you wanted to confirm, and ignoring the evidence that suggests otherwise. And it's very important to have, very good statistical tests and so on, and procedures in place such that it does highlight when that's occurring, we can exclude it. And so we recognize that this is important and we have to exclude it. Intellectual virtues help us here because they force you to re-articulate your reasons over again, because they force you to, well, they don't force you, that's the point, you're motivated, you desire to engage with others and so on. So the propulsion comes from within. So you want to hear other people's reasons, you want to engage them, you want to rehearse your own reasons again. And it makes you aware of possible, gaps in your knowledge, possible, counter evidence and so on, in a way that you just simply wouldn't if you just stuck your beliefs and always went for whatever confirms those beliefs. So I think, confidence is fine. There's nothing wrong with having confidence in your opinions if it's a grounded confidence. But that confidence has to sit side by side with a willingness to engage with others and a willingness to re-articulate your reasons, to discuss other people's counter reasons, and it has to sit side by side with a real respect, an intellectual respect for others and for the truth.
Yeah. Okay. I'm going to leave that topic off for a little bit. The thing that comes up all the time in the literature, at least as I was preparing for a discussion about intellectual humility, is listening. but I don't feel like there's enough emphasis on the value of it. So I want to talk with you a little bit or ask a question or two. My sense is that we all start out with a set of assumptions, and the intellectual humble person will constantly test those assumptions to see if they remain correct or intact. And then new information might come into play, or a varied belief might come into play, and we would then adjust our thinking. But the only way that those inputs can come in is if we're actively listening and giving validity to the person that's providing that source of adjustment. So the question is listening a big part of intellectual humility, or is it the biggest part of intellectual humility?
So listening is really important. The crucial thing is there's got to be, and this is kind of implicit in what you said actually, it's got to be what I would call an active listening rather than a passive listening. Yeah. So a lot of these traits can be manifested in active and passive ways. I mean, think about perception. A lot of our perception is just passive. You open your eyes and you see lots of things. So compare perception with observation. Observation is active perception. That's when you actually interrogate your environment. You pick out the salient details. It's the difference between Sherlock Holmes and Watson. That's in a nutshell. And it's the same with listening. You can listen in a passive way where the words go in and you just you hear what you want to hear and so forth. But there's an active listening, which is more like a sort of, as with the difference between perception and observation, it's more like an interrogation of the ideas in play. And I think it's really important, if you care about the truth and you have an intellectual respect for others, that it's a charitable interrogation of those ideas. You're trying to work out the other person's perspective in the most charitable way possible, right? You're trying to make sense of what they're trying to say in a manner which makes as much sense as possible. And in fact, if anything, poses as much of a challenge to your view as you possibly can. I mean, this is like we try and train people up in philosophy. We say when you criticize someone else's view, always try and, even if you end up making the view more plausible, that's a good thing. Right. You've got to take your opponent in their strongest form, and that might mean adding, bells and whistles to their argument that weren't there.
Right.
And I think this is what we need to do if we genuinely care about the truth. When we engage with others, that's what we're doing. It's not just a passive listening and taking what they say, because then we could just, if they make mistakes, we could just exploit those mistakes to win the argument. But it's not about winning the argument. It's about a kind of joint enterprise of getting to the truth.
Yeah, I fully agree with that. I think that in general, we've got to be vigilant in the knowledge that we are in fact actually driving for the truth, right? We can be meaning to drive for the truth, but we may somehow be stopping ourselves. What do we know about the science behind intellectual humility? Is there a way to measure our intellectual humility? Is there brain science associated with it? I'm not, frankly, I don't know if that's something you study or don't. But given the chance to talk to somebody who spends a good portion of their life with this, I just thought I'd ask.
So, there's lots of science which is relevant to this, on cognitive biases, for example. There's lots of science which is related to measures of different kinds of intellectual traits, like intellectual creativity, tenacity, and so forth. And these are things that are fairly easy to measure. What's quite tricky, though, with humility, I think, and in my view anyway, has stymied a lot of research on it, is that there hasn't been a clear conception of what it is that they're trying to measure. And I think until that's in play, you're not going to get that. I mean, one of the difficulties here is that a lot of these traits, there's like a sort of ghost trait that goes along with it, which someone can have even if they don't have the virtue. I mentioned a while ago, someone who lacks the right motivations, they might act in ways that look intellectually humble, but they're not actually humble because it's all strategic for them. It's all a show. And the problem is if all you're measuring is just the surface behavior, then how do you distinguish between the virtuous behavior and the other kind of ghost behavior, the ghost virtue? And I think this is why it's really important to nail down exactly what it is we're trying to measure before we can measure it. Yeah. And in fact, funnily enough, this is something I've been talking to psychologists about recently and cognitive scientists. So we're right now actually trying to get a project together which is all about that. It's about bringing together different conceptions of intellectual humility and then finding ways of empirically measuring those different conceptions. I mean, in fact, I'm going to obviously push my own view. So, but even if my view isn't the view that holds triumphant, it doesn't matter. We could say, look, there's intellectual humility of this kind, of that kind, and so on. And then once we're clear about what the differences are, then we can measure them in different ways and see what different kinds of mechanisms promote those traits.
Well, you just practiced intellectual humility right there. I don't know if you spotted that, but regardless, I will be waiting patiently for you to provide the measurable definition for it, because in our business we call it being transactional, right? If you're not truly motivated by the value of the knowledge, then you're being transactional. Right. Okay, last three questions. The obvious. Is there anything specific to intellectual humility that you want to talk about that we haven't talked about yet that's significant to bring out for this particular audience?
I suppose one thing that interests me is how intellectual humility, this outward directed conception that I favor, how it relates to what you might think of the sort of civic virtues, our sort of, our virtues in civic life, public life. And I think there's something really lacking in public life at the moment about the way we treat, the way political opponents treat each other, the way, in the sense of the media treats people. It's I think a respect for reasons and a respect for persons tends to go hand in hand. And I think, often a defense of, important democratic institutions goes hand in hand with a love and concern for the truth and so forth. And you can't tease them apart, it seems to me. And I think that characterizing the virtues in these outward directed ways is important to understanding why, what's gone wrong in some of these public debates, because they're not manifesting these respect for others, And it's crucial that you can have that respect for others, even if you think they're completely wrong, even if you think you're completely right and they're completely wrong. That by itself is not a reason to lose respect for other people. To be virtuous is to still nonetheless to engage with people, to be willing to offer reasons, to willing to respect them and their point of view. And I think we need to rediscover that.
I agree. Civil discourse, the notion of it has worn, sadly, very thin. Okay, so I know in our discussions you pointed me to an interesting blog post. I'm certain I know, having done the research, that there's significantly more material. What specific resources would you point interested people to to study intellectual humility a little bit further?
So the one thing that's been amazing, I think, just the last 5-10 years is just the huge growth of materials on this. One place you might want to look is a MOOC, a massive open online course that I was involved in with a colleague, Ian Church, which is on intellectual humility. If you just stick that in, it's on Coursera. And there's a textbook that goes with it, which I think is very useful, which Ian Church co-wrote with a colleague of his. It's great because it splits it up into the sort of the science and the applications of this, it's different viewpoints. And then there are lots of different projects going on around the world. Mike Lynch at the University of Connecticut's got a great project going on there about intellectual humility and conviction in public life. I know Alessandra Tamasini at Cardiff has got a very nice project going on looking at some of the science behind intellectual humility and so on. And once you get into this, you'll discover actually there's a torrent of material. One thing I'd quite like to do, if in the next project I'd like to get involved with, is to bring some of these things together in a more systematic way, because I think we've gone from a situation where there was next to nothing on it to now there's like there's just in a sense too much, because we need to find a way of mapping it all out, get a kind of topography of what's going on. And that's sort of the next phase for me. But I think if anyone wants to get an introduction to this, have a look at that MOOC. That's a good place to start. Yeah, that Coursera, that's what you're referring to. Yeah, I actually looked through, and you can see the syllabus, or at least a good chunk of the syllabus online, which is, I think I agree, it's a great place to start. Do you cultivate much of a social following? Do people keep up with your work or your research from afar? Is it via university or Twitter, or is there some kind of a professor, logging, cataloging? I mean, I do the blog posts, interviews, and things like that. I mean, I guess if I'm honest, I don't feel like it's kind of my forte, that kind of thing. I've got colleagues like, I don't know if you've come across Michael Lynch, he's a good friend of mine. He's got the kind of he's got the sort of the chutzpah, it's got the kind of, for that sort of thing. Whereas I feel a bit more introverted. So yeah, I don't cultivate it as much as perhaps I should. And a lot of academics do these days. I tend to sort of do a little bit here and there and then recede back into the background.
Not the rock star professor as of now.
I'm no Michael Sandel,
All right then. Well, look, that's it. I'd like to thank you for a very deep and engaging discussion. I've enjoyed it a lot.
Yeah, me too. Thanks for having me on.
This has been Intangibles. I'd like to thank Denton's Venture Technology Group at dentonsventurebeyond.com for being the sponsor this season and a supportive partner. Operating as a boutique within the world's largest law firm, the Venture Technology Group runs with hard-charging tech entrepreneurs to drive growth through strategic business, finance, and legal advice from Silicon Valley and New York to London, Berlin, Hong Kong, and beyond. Learn more at dentonsventurebeyond.com. I'd like to thank VC Careers for their support, and I'd also like to thank Ben Gloway, who's a fantastic sound engineer. It is a privilege to work with him. Find him on Twitter. His handle is @visible_sound. And thank you. Keep an eye out for the next episode. I'm your host, Steve BERG.